Thank you, Peter, for the nice introduction. I'm really very happy to have the opportunity to present our work here at that great conference. It's entitled Greenwashing and CEO Integrity, and the work is related with a student of mine, Raphael Sachel, also from LMU. So the starting point of our study is the observation that societies become more and more environmentally aware, and that stakeholders, as a consequence of that increase in awareness, are having larger expectations that firms behave in an environmentally friendly way. Now, research documents that firms increasingly respond to that environmental expectation by engaging in greenwashing. That means in disclosure activities that are aimed to mislead information recipients into adopting overly favorable beliefs about a firm's environmental behavior. Now, what we want to study is whether a CEO integrity is an important determinant of a firm's greenwashing activities, and to what extent the information recipients actually see through the firm's greenwashing behavior. Now, to be more precise, greenwashing, some observers have claimed to be the new climate misinformation battleground. What we assume here or consider is that greenwashing messages are those which make firms look greener than they actually are. Messages that mislead the recipients, even though the messages are not totally untrue or unlawful. And very often that applies to messages which are unaudited or hard to verify. So basically, we're talking about voluntary disclosures by firms. The Economist, in a recent issue, has picked up on that issue and has stated that investors, as they become wiser to such flim-flam or greenwashing, that investors also have grown to be more skeptical regarding firms' voluntary environmental disclosures. So from prior work, we do know that firms' greenwashing activities vary with various determinants at the firm level, such as the environmental damage that a firm is experiencing, the firm's performance, societal and institutional pressures, or even the coverage by media. However, we all know from other work that managers ultimately make the disclosure decisions, and in particular, therefore, that managerial characteristics are potential drivers of greenwashing. What we focus on in our study is now the managerial integrity, which is the inclination of managers to honor one's word as a potential determinant of greenwashing activities. So the two questions that we ask are, first, whether CEO integrity is associated with a firm's greenwashing activity, and then secondly, how information recipients assess the firm's greenwashing activity in combination with CEO integrity. The two hypotheses that we investigate are, first, whether CEO integrity is associated with greenwashing. And here, greenwashing we consider as a discrepancy between a firm's environmental performance and the firm's environmental disclosures. So the basic idea is that the CEO decides whether or not to voluntarily release information on the firm's environmental performance, and that the CEO in particular may also decide to release reports which are inconsistent with the firm's environmental performance. Now, a low-integrity CEO is likely less concerned about such questionable disclosure practices than a high-integrity CEO, who's more concerned about honoring one's words and also about the associated reputational issues. So that leads us to our first hypothesis, which is that the relation between environmental performance and voluntary environmental disclosures is moderated by CEO integrity. In our second research question, we consider how information recipients now assess the greenwashing activities, given and taking into consideration CEO integrity. We know from attribution theory that recipients ultimately use the attributes of the information senders in order to understand and evaluate the sender's behavior. There's a broad literature that supports attribution theory. For example, research has identified that stakeholders consider the motives between firms' CSR initiatives, and more generally, other work has shown that investors assess managers' motives and evaluate disclosures accordingly. So given this work, this prior work, our second hypothesis is that we expect there to be a relation between voluntary environmental disclosures and the environmental performance as assessed by the recipients, that this relation is moderated by CEO integrity. Now, our research design is such that for our first research question, we consider the relation between a firm's environmental performance and voluntary environmental disclosures moderated by CEO integrity. We operationalize the firm's environmental performance by looking at the pollution in terms of carbon emission of the firm. The voluntary environmental disclosures we operationalize by looking at the tweets on firms' Twitter accounts and to what extent these tweets are including environmental terms that come from a CSR-related word list identified by Penkle and Malaescu. So whenever a firm's tweet includes such an environmental term, we consider that tweet to be an environmental or green tweet. CEO integrity, our moderator here, reflects the truthfulness of the CEO. There's broad literature that investigates and operationalizes the truthfulness or deception of CEOs. And we follow that literature, Larker and Sakalyukina and Hope and Wang, by looking at shareholder letters signed by the CEO in order to identify to what extent CEOs are more or less deceptive. For our second research question, we look at the association between voluntary environmental disclosures and the assessed environmental performance moderated by CEO integrity. The assessed environmental performance either depends on the assessment by investors, where we look at abnormal returns, or it considers the assessed environmental performance by ESG analysts when we look at environmental ratings. We investigate our research design and the sample that we consider reflects German firms from the HDAX in the time period between 2015 and 2020. What do we find? So for our first research question, we find that low integrity CEOs, in contrast to high integrity CEOs, appear to engage in greenwashing on Twitter, which means that they make use of voluntary environmental disclosures to an extent that is not warranted by their environmental performance. So specifically, we find that for deceptive CEOs, an increase in pollution is associated with more green tweets, whereas for the truthful CEOs, an increase in pollution is associated with fewer green tweets. To our second research question, we find that the information recipients, so the investors and the ESG analysts, appear to see through any misleading disclosures. And that means that for the investors, we find that for the deceptive CEOs, green tweeting is actually associated with lower abnormal returns, whereas for the truthful CEOs, green tweeting is associated with higher abnormal returns. And for the ESG analysts, we find a similar association between the green tweeting and either a worsened or an improved environmental rating. So to conclude and highlight the contribution and the implications from our study. So first of all, we think that we contribute by identifying managerial characteristics, specifically CEO integrity, as a determinant of voluntary disclosures in general, but more specifically as a determinant of greenwashing. So our results suggest that unregulated channels such as Twitter are used for impression management, i.e. greenwashing, by low integrity centers. Our second contribution refers to how information recipients actually use managerial characteristics to evaluate disclosures. And here we find that the information recipients appear to have the capabilities to infer and also act on the managerial characteristics. So that implies or suggests, when you think about regulation, that professional information recipients, such as investors or ESG analysts, do not appear to be fooled by misleading disclosures, and therefore this suggests that regulation is not really necessary to regulate the use of Twitter by firms. So that's it, what we have. Thank you so much for your interest in our study, and I look forward to any future comments or questions. Thank you.